Hi, and welcome back to this month's episode of The Skin Check. The Skin Check with Jenn is a monthly segment that's hosted by me, Jenn Schultz, as an opportunity for low ultraviolet ambassadors and other skin cancer advocates to have a platform to share their story, offer advice, and show support for others. Today, I'm really excited to introduce you to Camille. I had the honor of getting to hear Camille speak on a panel about living with melanoma while we were at the Melanoma Research Alliance Patient Forum in February of this year. Camille was just 2 years out of college when she was diagnosed with stage 3B melanoma. Camille is also a marathon runner and a grad school student living in Boston. After hearing her speak about the unique challenges of being a young cancer survivor, I knew she was going to be a great guest for this month and bring a great perspective to AYA Cancer Awareness Month. So Camille, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you so much, Jenn, for having me. It's a real honor to be featured on the podcast, and I'm excited to share part of my story.
Yeah, we are so excited to have you. And your story at the patient forum was really powerful. But of course, we're all more than just our cancer story. So before we dig into more of the melanoma perspective, can you tell us a little bit more about who you are as a person before we start talking about the melanoma piece?
Definitely. I am half Australian, half Canadian, but I was raised in New York City. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about the Australian portion more because, of course, it's a country with so much skin cancer incidence. So have always been sensitive to that in my lifetime. I grew up in New York, but I attended Princeton for my undergrad degree, where I also played on the women's squash team. So sports have always been a really big part of my life and something that brings me a lot of joy. I worked in New York City after graduation as a consultant. I focused mostly on public sector healthcare provision and healthcare related topics during COVID and also consumer goods. And I'm now a graduate student studying a dual master's in public policy and an MBA. I love to run. I'm a big squash player. I ski. I love to be active and be outdoors. And that's certainly not something that I've lost even after my skin cancer diagnosis, something that's still very important to me.
Yeah, and there's so many pieces just in your introduction that I know we're going to talk about more that really intertwine. And one of those is just really being able to maintain who you are outside of cancer through all of your treatment and everything. But I know when you were first diagnosed, so the doctors had originally wanted to do a Mohs surgery. And something I think that was really important in this piece of your story is a lot of times with melanoma, we know that it's really important to treat it quickly, but you and your family were able to kind of put your foot on the brakes and say, wait a minute, we need to slow down, take a step back, and get more information because it's so important to also make sure with any kind of illness that you're getting the right treatment for you and to advocate for that. So with that, can you tell us a little bit more about the diagnosis, how it came about, and then what that's taught you about advocating for yourself medically?
Certainly. My melanoma was actually located in my ear, the original tumor. And so when I first got diagnosed, doctors suspected that it was quite shallow, just given there isn't all that much to your ear outside of that first layer of skin and then a fair bit of cartilage.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back, upon first receiving my diagnosis, I feel like we were so woefully uninformed about what melanoma even was and what kind of the variations on the diagnosis and prognosis were. And I'm sure a lot of people who end up with a chronic illness feel that way because as, non-medical people, at least in my family, it was just not something we'd ever focused on. And my family doesn't have a history of skin cancer. And so I remember receiving the call from this doctor that I had gone to for a full body skin check after my mom had noticed this little kind of scrape in my ear. And she said, maybe you should go to the doctor just to get like an antibacterial cream or something for it. It looked like an infected bug bite or something. And I scheduled an appointment with this derm, got a full body skin check. And at first pass, he actually didn't even notice the scrape in my ear. And when he was done with the skin check, I said, well, actually, the real reason I came in was for this scrape. Do you mind to take a look at it? And he said, it looks a little weird. I'm not that worried about it, but let me just take a biopsy just in case. And I'll never forget getting that phone call from him the next day because he was as shocked as I was. And of course, he wasn't a melanoma specialist, but he was a dermatologist. And like I mentioned, I look back now and I just cannot believe like the volume of information I've accrued about melanoma in the 3 years that have passed since that moment, or 2.5 years that have passed since that moment. But like you mentioned, there's a real bias towards action when you have a diagnosis like this. And my family, everyone was on the internet. What does this mean? What are the variations on melanoma? What are the survival rates? Who's the best doctor in New York to deal with this kind of an issue? And like you said, the first person that we went to said, let's just immediately do Mohs. It's in your ear. It's probably very shallow. I wouldn't be too stressed. Likely stage 0, stage 1. Let's just address this as quickly as possible. And my mom, to her credit, said, you know what, let's slow down for a second and get a couple of opinions. Because, you always hear you should connect with different doctors, you should get different opinions. And it's hard to really stick to that in a moment that feels so urgent. And yet she was great about that. So we sought a couple of different opinions and we ultimately got connected to MRA. And Mark Hurlbert, who's now the CEO of MRA, recommended that we connect with Memorial Sloan Kettering. And they were much more conservative in their approach. They said, let's do another biopsy. Let's see. We did another. We realized that the tumor was a fair bit deeper than anyone had suspected. It went all the way through that skin layer on the ear. And they didn't go into the cartilage, but they suspected it might even be kind of pushing its way over there. And so I decided to go with my MSK medical team because it seemed like they were just very measured in anything that they were doing. And because it was an integrated treatment system, I could have a dermatologist there, a medical oncologist there, a head and neck surgeon there. Everyone would be within the same umbrella. And that was really comforting for me. And so I try to live by that as I deal with the post-emptive side effects and the treatment that everyone requires after their initial melanoma diagnosis and all my ongoing care. Whenever we get new information, instead of just saying, okay, we'll take the first action that's recommended to us, I try really hard to take a day, take 2 days, talk to other people, because I think that caution served us so well in that moment, even though it was really hard to pump the brakes when you're so afraid and surprised and you just want to deal with the situation as quickly as possible.
Right. That diagnosis, there's so much emotion tied up in first, like hearing those words, excuse me. And like you said, it's like you're really caught off guard. And especially when your own doctor is surprised too, there's a lot of like, what can we do? We need to handle this right now. But emotions and just like the feeling of uncertainty and discomfort is so high that it kind of almost triggers like a fight or flight. We just want to deal with it as fast as we can. But there's a couple other pieces that you mentioned in there too. First, like MSK is obviously a really renowned hospital, but then having that integrated care team where you have like oncology and dermatology and all the different aspects really working together, but to bring in their own specialties and making sure that everyone is communicating well, but you're getting like holistic care is also a huge piece that unfortunately I think is not always the case. We're not always lucky to have that. Like a lot of people would benefit from that and it isn't always there available.
Absolutely. And this element of like doctor collaboration, there was some uncertainty even after my surgery, given what was found in the surgical site. And what the doctors at MSK did was bring together several people of the same specialty to look at the results and kind of through a popular vote decide what they would recommend for my treatment course, given the uncertainty in my diagnosis. And I appreciated that too, that they would come to me after having deliberated internally. And I think that integrative approach really benefits from that too, just the collaboration, because nothing is black or white in medicine. I think we have the tendency to believe that doctors just know and they're going to give you the most modern kind of treatment that you have access to, and they're just right. But the reality is there are shades of gray in any diagnosis, in any treatment course. There are always other options. And so the fact that they came together as a group and decided on what they unanimously recommended as my course of treatment in the face of uncertainty was really comforting.
Yeah, because in a medical setting, like in a textbook, it maybe is more black and white, but we're constantly learning new things and being humans and not like something in a test tube or under a scope. It brings a lot of different variables to it, but then also is important because they're also like caring for you as a human too, by being able to have that collaborative approach and really tailoring it directly towards you. The other thing that you noted that I think is so common is anyone who's diagnosed with melanoma, especially like the first time in the cases where people have more than one occurrence, is we all know so very little about it at the time of diagnosis. And so there is that urgency to come up with a plan, come up with a treatment, start treating it as soon as possible. But the doctors have the limited information that they have in front of them, but then we have almost none. So we're starting really from zero and trying to find a lot of things. And I love that you really kind of made a point to call it a chronic illness, because we very rarely hear melanoma described that way. Unfortunately, those outside of the skin cancer community think of it as, oh, it's just skin cancer. And it really is a chronic illness, because one of the unique things about melanoma is even, when you go through and the cancer's gone, you're still doing ongoing skin checks, and it really becomes part of the rest of your life in a way that to a degree other cancers are, but it is chronic. And for a lot of us, it is chronic with recurrences or atypical moles and all of that. So I just thought it was so important that you were able to like see that and call it out.
Certainly. And I think it's something that I've been sort of coming to terms with. I finished active treatment just about 6 months ago now. And to most of my friends and family, it appears that treatment is done and that cancer is over, and that there's a comforting element in that too, or like a kind of an emotional management side of that. You want to believe that it's all over, but I recognize now that it is sort of going to be a part of the fabric of my life forever, because I will go back for the checks. I'll be attentively managing it. And, that's not something that I fear per se. But to your point, I think a lot of people on the outside think like, oh, that's something that she fought through and she, won the battle against. But there's always going to be management. And I feel very grateful to have such a great medical team that I have so much trust in. But I think it's important to recognize, especially for those who don't, who aren't fighting this themselves, but have a close family member or friend who is a cancer survivor, is that this journey is not really ever over per se. So being supportive even after the active treatment is over is something I definitely ask for from my family and my close friends.
Mm-hmm. And I think even just for people that maybe are newer to their diagnosis, to hear it early on too, because I think a lot of times when we're going through treatment, we're looking towards the end of it because we are trying to get through it and be able to like beat it or be cancer free. But then sometimes it sneaks up on us because we aren't expecting like, oh, this, even once it's over, it's not over. And so I think it's helpful that when they get to the other side and there's not kind of that sense of relief or peace, that is normal. And just being able to find like that trust in the care team and knowing that things are going to be okay, but also being able to come to terms with it is something that is just a part of our lives from now on, and making space for that.
Certainly. And I think when we were at the MRA Patient Exchange Forum, I felt the silver lining of the strength of the melanoma community and the cancer community at large. I think when you're a survivor and an advocate after you're finished with active treatment, there are still so many opportunities to connect with others who really understand what you've been through. So I try very intentionally to seek these silver linings, and that community of people is a really bright one at least for me, because you don't have to really explain anything to that community because they have sort of an innate understanding through their own experience of what it is to go through the difficulties of treatment and also the difficulties that follow treatment. So I think even after you're kind of done with active treatment, that community still understands the continued sort of low burn stress that having been a cancer patient at one point creates. And so I try hard to sort of connect with others who are either undergoing treatment or have completed their treatment, because there's, again, just a sense of, you see me, I see you.
Yeah, and that was one thing that you did a really good job of putting words to on the panel that day. So you had said that once sharing your story no longer felt like reliving the trauma of the diagnosis and the treatment, it was really helpful to you in telling people about your story, and it kind of helped ease the burden of going through it and kind of feeling like you're going through it alone. That community helps you feel less alone, less isolated. But then how does sharing your story continue to help you today in other ways?
Definitely. Well, first of all, this was such an important part of my life for 2 years that I think for friends that I'm developing or getting closer to, sharing that is almost necessary because it was such a central part of my life. Just like talking about, the family that you grew up in becomes important when you're getting really close with a friend. Similarly, talking about that 2-year journey and all the ways that it changed my life outlook and my relationship to various people in my life is an important thing just for people to understand, I think, to truly know me. And so I share it in the interest of, or in moments of sort of getting closer to others in my life. But also, like you mentioned, I think as humans, we're just such storytellers in general, and there's such importance and power in framing and narrative. And when you're in such an intense situation, like, fighting or battling a diagnosis of this kind, you can't frame it or create a narrative around it because you're in it every single day and you're just sort of living in the day to day. But then as you get a little bit more distance from it, it's a helpful exercise, at least for me, to sort of synthesize that experience, then this happened, this is what changed at this moment. And by creating the story around it and getting to share that with people, it sort of bookends the experience for me and makes it more consumable and digestible in my memory, in a way that, like, when you're in it, I think is just too hard. So there's been real benefit to me in like developing that narrative and to a certain extent that talk track. When I'm telling people about what I experienced for the first time, I notice myself using some of the similar phrases that I've used in other conversations because I'm starting to develop that story of what that was. And that's been very cathartic for me and has made it more possible for me to kind of move on from that moment because it starts to solidify in my memory as a true memory instead of something that I'm currently experiencing.
And I think that hearing those stories and experiences really helps people that maybe haven't been through it or haven't known somebody else who also went through it. Because one of the challenges, I think, is when we're the one who's going through cancer or like a really difficult medical diagnosis, it's hard to help people understand, especially when we're just sort of putting our head down and trying to manage it and battle through it. And talking about it can be dramatic. But for people on the outside, a lot of times they want to help, but they don't know how, or they don't know what to say, or they don't know how to cope. And so I think people tend to either show up and just show up messy, or they kind of disappear from our lives. And you did a really good job of describing this as like your peripheral friend group. But then when you get to the other side, and then the messages and like the texts and those things kind of start to come back, and they're really long because they're trying to apologize for disappearing and explaining why they did. and there's guilt, but they didn't know how to show up. What advice would you give to another young person who has a friend that was just diagnosed with cancer or something else that's very serious medically?
Definitely. No, I think what you said resonates so much with me. I would say don't be afraid to check in. Don't be shy to raise it. I've had a lot of people say, gosh, I didn't want to remind you of it or make you feel uncomfortable by bringing it up. But for someone who's going through something like that, it's on their mind literally every minute. And so you're not bringing it up unprompted to send a text message and say, how was your latest scan? Can I do anything? Is there anything you want to do? How are you feeling? That's not reminding the person who is diagnosed of anything because it's guaranteed already on their mind. I just think it makes them feel so much more supported. And so I was grateful for those messages from friends who recognized after the fact that they just didn't know how to deal with it. But now that I'm sort of through it, I say to anyone and everyone who knows someone who's going through something difficult, just don't be afraid to check in. And if someone has a different response to me and actually doesn't want to talk about it, or they're more private than I was, they'll tell you it. But I think probably erring on the side of checking in more frequently is better than letting the person feel like they're going through it alone.
Because it already feels very lonely, very
It's
isolating.
very isolating.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's very isolating. It's hard to feel like anybody really understands you. And in service of that, I think some of the hospitals have done a great job of setting up support groups, young adult support groups, pediatric support groups, adult support groups, to make people really feel understood and feel like they have a community around them. But I don't think it has to exclusively be people who've gone through something similar. I really think friends and family who haven't had a serious diagnosis of that kind can still make a huge difference and can still achieve a level of empathy that makes the diagnosed person feel a lot less alone.
And I think there's even maybe an added layer of importance to it with young people going through cancer, because you already feel alone, but then it can feel like your friend group is moving on without you. Their experiences are all of a sudden so different than yours. And when you're going through treatment, we're the youngest people in the rooms. Like, you look around and nobody else looks like us. And so it's taking that feeling of isolation and then amplifying it exponentially. And one of the ways that you pointed out too, also, that the experiences are so different, is just even around dating. So, and I have to share this because you shared a quote from your mom, and I resonated so much just with the whole idea, because even after I was cancer free with my first diagnosis and stuff like that, I had a lot of biopsies after and was still having excisions. And sometimes even 2 years post cancer, I still felt very much like a cancer patient. And I personally quit dating because I was like, this is a burden for me. Like, how do I ask somebody else to be a part of that? And you were sharing some of those own concerns with your mom, but having just come out of a pandemic, didn't want to just keep not living life. And your mom said, and this is a general quote from the patient forum, but she said, well, that's an amazing screening mechanism if they're not interested in you because of that, and then you don't want them anyway. So first of all, where was your mom when I was going through this? But then I think it just really highlights how our experience becomes so different from our friend group and others of our age that are going through a cancer diagnosis, because we're in such a different part of our life, and it can be very hard. And I think that's sometimes why friends disappear, because they're dating and going to movies and doing homework and going to class or starting a career, and you're going to immunotherapy or those type of things, and the experiences become just so vastly different. How were you able to find ways to still connect with your friends when that experience was so different?
Yeah, I think my close friends were awesome about making social situations or curating social situations I felt comfortable with. So this was pandemic, and immunocompromised or at least vulnerable. And I didn't want to put anybody else at Memorial Sloan Kettering at risk, of course, too. So I was very COVID sensitive. And they were great about, outdoor picnics and walks and things of that sort. And, not to sugarcoat it, it was really hard. People wanted to go out to the bar on Saturday night. This is New York City. As the pandemic is just starting to lift, things are starting to look up, and all of a sudden I can't participate in any of that. And I was so disappointed in some ways because 2020 felt stolen. 2021 suddenly felt stolen, and 2022 as well. But I think part of what helped me in that moment was not only my friends being really sensitive to it, but also just giving myself permission to do things that I was comfortable with. And sometimes that meant, scheduling a brunch with a friend and that morning being like, you know what, I'm feeling really anxious about going to a brunch indoors with a bunch of people, or I had a really terrible sleep because I'm on, targeted therapy and I just had a really bad night, or I'm really feverish today, and saying I can't do it. And being honest with my friends, my close friends, brought me closer to them and also made me feel like I didn't really have to drag myself through anything just to kind of like show up and show face. And my close friends were so understanding about that, and it helped them kind of get what I was going through a little bit better, because if I had sort of made up some alternate excuse or just removed myself from socializing altogether, I think it would have made them feel like I was kind of rejecting them. But instead, I just tried to opt for extreme honesty. And I know that was sometimes also disappointing. Like I missed birthday brunches of close friends. I missed birthday parties. I missed engagement parties, whatever it was. But I think I really had to listen to myself and my body in that time, and the people in your life who you're closest to get that. And yeah, it was definitely weird. The one other anecdote I just have to share is before I started targeted therapy, I went through cryopreservation to freeze my eggs because we didn't know what the impact to my fertility would be. And as you were mentioning, everybody else in the fertility clinic that I went to over at Weill Cornell was probably on average 10 years older than me. I was 24 at the time. I'm now 27. And at that stage, 24, nobody was talking about egg freezing in my friend group. Now they're starting to kind of tiptoe around the topic. But at that time, no one was talking about it. And so I would go to the cryopreservation center, and it would be couples in their early 30s doing this together. And when we first checked in, the lady at the desk said, "Oh, do you have like a partner here with you?" I think it's a standard question that they ask people. And my mom, thinking that it meant like treatment partner, which she was for me, she goes, "Me, I'm her partner." And I'm like, "Mom, no, that's not what she
not
means.
That kind of partner.
Not that kind of partner." Yeah, exactly. But so yeah, it's a different stage, and being young and going through this kind of an issue, you can feel a little bit like a loose buoy, because the experiences of others that you're in the waiting room with don't really resonate with your own. So I just think being true to yourself and asking your friends to be understanding, which they probably naturally will do, and finding ways to socialize that feel good to you. And that may mean, staying in 8 weekends in a row and having a friend come over and watch a movie and suck on ice cubes with you, or whatever it is. It doesn't really matter. Just like finding little ways to connect with other people in spite of it, and not allowing yourself to be socially isolated just because you can't participate in the typical stuff that folks around you would be doing, like the clubbing and the barring and whatever else.
Yeah, well, and the fertility preservation really emphasizes a couple other things too. The first one is really like going back to kind of being able to take a step back and slow down, because like I have friends who have had other types of cancers where like breast cancer, for example. A friend of mine was just a few years older than you when she was diagnosed with breast cancer, and fertility preservation, like not always is it covered by insurance. So that can be like a timepiece. And getting the funds to be able to do it. So there's like these levels of barriers to being able to do it that maybe you can find a solution to, but then they also require more time. And when you're going into cancer treatment, it feels like you're sort of in a race against time. And so being able to take a step back and figure out what's right for you, and the fertility preservation is just such another unique experience to that AYA cancer group, because a lot of times people that have cancer, and this doesn't diminish obviously their challenges at all, especially if they have a family or a young family, but like you're thinking so far into the future and trying to hold on to those options. Can I have a family? Will I be able to start a family? And being able to not have to give up on things just because you were diagnosed really young.
Yeah, certainly. And there's a huge access issue, of course. I was really lucky through all of this. And I just want to acknowledge that my employer sponsored health insurance plan was really comprehensive, and I benefited hugely from that. And I think there's an important conversation to be had that we could do a whole separate podcast about, to talk about how people have to make hard trade-offs when they don't have that kind of coverage. In my policy classes, we talk a lot about healthcare and healthcare coverage and, the cost of healthcare in the United States. I did most of my treatment in the US, and I did a little bit of it in Australia as well, where they have sort of a nationalized health system, just talking about the differences. And she asked me to kind of sum up the total cost of care across those 2 years. And I looked into my sort of insurance records, and perhaps unsurprisingly, over 2 years, the total billed cost largely to my insurer was almost $1 million. And that's wild in the instance that someone doesn't have strong health insurance and has to make trade-offs because, targeted therapy can cost upwards of $30,000 a month. That's just an inaccessible price for many. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I feel very lucky, and my experience may not be representative of everyone's, because I never had to make decisions based on relative prices of drugs or treatment options because of that coverage that I had.
Yeah, I mean, dealing with anything, especially because the whole medical debt piece is another thing that really hits like AYA cancer patients extra hard too, because a lot of times you haven't built a career, you haven't built that nest egg, you haven't built a savings. Are you on your parents' health insurance, or are you on your own health insurance? If you're new to a company, what does that health insurance look like? And so, like you said, I mean, that could be a much larger, probably a much longer conversation, but it also ties in just like the workforce aspect too. So like you were just out of school, you were working as a consultant at that time, and some people have to continue to work, like financially they need to, but then a lot of us just want to continue working and doing something to maintain some sort of like sense of normalcy, or just to give us something to do besides thinking about cancer all day long. How did you go about navigating those conversations with your managers and coworkers?
Yeah, to your point, I really wanted to continue working both for my mental well-being, but also because I was really passionate about what I was doing at the time. I was working on vaccine distribution during COVID. I found my work really meaningful. I wanted to keep on living life, which is definitely a theme of this podcast. But I think it was really important to be vulnerable with my managers. And those first conversations were really hard, both because it's an uncomfortable thing to talk about with someone who you're not deeply personally close with, which many of us aren't with those we work with, but also because it's uncomfortable for them too. They don't necessarily know how to react or what to say. But I was very lucky in that I had managers who were really in my corner, who said, we will make this work for you, whether a 60% capacity model or you just have to take time off at different intervals, like we will make this work. But they never would have been able to make it work for me had I not been really honest and vulnerable about what I imagined my constraints would be. And there was an element of inconsistency in how I was able to work over the course of those next 2 years. Like some days, as we mentioned before, I would have worse side effects than others. And so it took a lot of courage, and I will say wasn't always great about it, to sometimes wake up in the morning and just say, you know what, I cannot do it today. Like, I cannot work for I can't sit at my computer all day today, and do work, because I just need to rest. And being kind of honest again with myself and with my managers, even when we had some massive presentation to get done and I was a critical part of it. Your health is just more important than anything else that's going on at any time, and especially more important than work. And I think strong work cultures and places that have a strong work culture will recognize that and celebrate those boundaries. And I certainly felt that my employer, on most of the projects that I was on, especially with managers I'd worked with before and had sort of a personal rapport with, were great about acknowledging that. But it's a two-way street. You have to be honest and clear, and they have to be accommodating and supportive. But without both of those, it's hard to make it work. But I think as the individual going through something hard, just embracing that vulnerability and opening up on a topic that can be very taboo in the workplace is important.
Mm-hmm. And it's another thing that it could be another really long side conversation, but cancer in the workplace is something that it doesn't get talked about a lot. But there's a statistic that like 50% of the workforce will be impacted by cancer while they're like in working age. And I think most employers want to be helpful and want to support their employees, but don't often know how. So I love how you were able to kind of share both sides of that, not just what the employer can do, but also how you were able to sort of advocate yourself and be able to clearly explain what you were going to need as well, and for them to be able to kind of meet you where you were at and make that possible.
Yeah, it definitely built my loyalty for the place as well, and my loyalty to those people who were really in my corner professionally, and brought me closer to them. So definitely encourage others to be clear, and if it's something that you want to do, to continue working, to try your utmost to make that work for you, because I think, again, places with strong cultures will make that happen for you.
Agreed. And so I want to sort of wrap things up with one final quote that you had said at the patient forum. And I think it does a really good job of sort of bringing this all together, because as you had just mentioned, our theme sort of is like, how do we keep experiencing and living life while we're going through this? And you said life keeps going while all of this is happening. And so you were very committed to still prioritizing the things in life that brought you joy, and not just putting your life on hold while you were fighting cancer. So how are you able to balance taking care of your physical needs, such as rest, while not giving up things you love, like running a freaking marathon, because you ran the Miami Marathon in the middle of treatment?
Yeah, I think in some ways my cancer treatment was a really clarifying time in helping me understand what my real priorities were and what really brought me joy. And one of those things was certainly physical activity. Another is time with friends and family. Another is travel. Like, there was a short list of things that became abundantly clear to me when I had such limited energy to expend on anything. And I told myself that I wasn't going to let this speed bump or roadblock, depending on how you look at it, keep me from doing those things and experiencing those things. And I really did not want to look back on this time in my life and view it as kind of a black box period, like 2 years that were just sunk. That was unacceptable to me, or that was not something I was willing to let happen. And so with this short list in hand, I was very intentional about prioritizing those things. I certainly would not recommend running the Miami Marathon in the middle of targeted therapy. It is It is hot and hard when you're struggling with temperature control, as many people on targeted therapy do. But yeah, I think with such limited time and energy, I just said, you know what, I'm going to do what I can every day to still live normally. And some days I really couldn't go for a run. And other days I felt great and I was running, a half marathon in a day and feeling on top of the world. But I think listening to one's body is super important, and just being really honest with oneself about, what is that list of things and how can I make sure that I don't look back at this time and wish I had invested more in those things, because you're not going to be able to hit rewind and get any of that time back. And I think mentally, at least for me, doing those things, continuing to prioritize my physical health, my athletics, my friends and family, my travel schedule, projects that I was interested in at work, continuing to prioritize those things was a great way to signal to myself that this diagnosis wasn't going to stop me and that I was going to overcome this illness. I think if I had stopped working out, stopped seeing friends and family, and kind of just like convalesced, I would have felt much more sort of at the mercy of my diagnosis than I did. And of course, there are many people fighting this illness who are not able to run or go out for a meal, and there are many variations on ability during cancer treatment. So that's not to dismiss any of those things, but I think doing what you can within your physical constraints to continue doing the stuff that you love is super important.
Yeah, I agree so much. It takes so much to be able to hold on to any of the things that we can do to still find like joy and happiness in the middle of it is so important. To anyone who might be listening that, was also either diagnosed at a young age or is young and just facing a recent diagnosis or going through treatment, what would you say to them?
I would say you've got this. First of all, I would say make sure that you listen to and prioritize yourself and your well-being. And I think a crucial part of that is mental health. So finding ways to keep your mental health strong, whether that's therapy, whether that's doing the things that you love, make sure that you're doing those things. And then finally, these are not lost years or lost months. This is a very challenging time, but you can still live an incredibly full life while undergoing all of this. So don't let this dominate everything, and look for the silver linings. Get into these communities, these groups, like we're here for you and we're not going anywhere.
Camille, thank you so much. Your story is so important, and I'm so glad that you were able to share it this month, especially because as much as we can really like connect and build a community for those that are feeling just really alone going through it, and tying it back to a month when we're trying to bring more awareness to the unique challenges of being a young cancer patient and cancer survivor. This is just going to be so impactful. So thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you, Jen. This has been awesome. And I'm so happy we've gone to chat about this and that there's a whole month dedicated to this really important issue. So thank you for giving me the chance to share.
Absolutely.